Cooper's father, who was a lawyer for the railroad in the early days of, bought a ranch up north about 50 miles, north of Craig, a little ways, just off the Missouri. It's called the 7 Bar Nun, and we went up there as well. We were looking, 7 Bar 9, excuse me. We were looking for sort of, I don't think I was trying to commune with Cooper's ghosts so much as just to get a sense of where he came from. And I think we got a very good sense of where he came from, and it was very helpful for me. I'd met his daughter Maria. I'd looked at the papers for High Noon in Hollywood and at the Motion Picture Academy Library. But coming up here and seeing, you know, where the man was born and some of the things that formed his really interesting character and personality was really helpful to me. So I was happy to be there then, and I'm awfully happy to be invited to come here now, and I'm very grateful to the folks here at the Montana Historical Society for helping arrange this. So thanks for having me here. So let me ask you, how many of you have seen High Noon? That's about what I thought. That's about what I thought. And how many of you have seen a Gary Cooper movie other than High Noon? Well, that's pretty good too. That's pretty good too. Well, a lot of you will know, and certainly I know, growing up in the 50s and 60s, that long before, you know, blockbuster movies and Google and all of that, the sort of biggest pop cultural phenomenon in America was the Western. Something like 1/3 of all of the movies made in Hollywood in the 1950s and mid-50s were Westerns, and 1/4 of the TV shows were also Westerns, and a lot of the folks who worked in those shows and some of the young stars of those shows went on to become big-time movie stars. People like Steve McQueen, for example, James Garner, they get their start on TV, they move into Hollywood Westerns. It was really the biggest thing going. You know, we had wonderful heroes in white hats and terrible villains in black hats. We had lovely and obedient women sitting at home. It was, you know, this was our story, our myth about, you know, our wonderful country and how it was made. And some of these movies were really thrilling, and some of them were just plain awful. But they really did set the myth for us, I think, in many ways. And they were about our frontier origins, our masculinity. And one of the best of them was High Noon, released in 1952 and starring our legendary film icon, Gary Cooper. Now, you know, most of you have seen the movie, but even folks who haven't seen High Noon, I think, recognize both the title, High Noon, and this image of the lawman walking down, you know, an almost empty street on his way to confront 4 armed men who are coming to town to kill him, led by their leader coming on the noontime train. And this image, with the badge, with the vest, the gun, on his own, has become something, you know, connotes a certain kind of mythic frontier hero, someone who confronts evil, even if he's by himself, confronts overwhelming odds at times. And High Noon has been beloved by a lot of people. I mean, it's been 65 years and we're still talking about it. Presidents have loved High Noon. Dwight Eisenhower, when it first came out, showed it 3 times in the White House. Bill Clinton says he screened it 20 times. There's something about, yeah, I guess the White House is kind of a lonely job sometimes. And you feel like everybody's out to get you, and sometimes you even feel like your good political friends are kind of peeling back away from you when, you know, things get tough. And so High Noon has given them some fortitude, I guess. And it's not just presidents. I mean, in 1989, when Poland had its first free democratic election in, you know, something like 2 generations, the most popular campaign poster was Gary Cooper, this time carrying the agenda of the Solidarity movement in his right hand, and a Solidarity badge just above his marshal's badge. So, you know, the movie itself was filmed in something like 30 days, 32 days all in all, on a shoestring budget. It was a rush job to fulfill the tail end of an old contract before the folks who made it moved on to something much more lucrative. And yet, to their surprise, I think to everybody's surprise, it kind of vaulted to great success immediately. Not only got great reviews, big lines at the box office, it's got a taut powerful narrative. I mean, you've seen it. I think most of you will know what I'm talking about. It's got wonderful performances. It's got that evocative theme song, which is highly unusual in the way it works, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then it's got that climactic shootout at the end. And it was an instant classic. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Cooper. And even today, it's considered one of Hollywood's most enduring films. And each generation has read into this film, as we do in a lot of films, its own politics and values and sensibility. But what's largely been forgotten is that High Noon was made at a very specific moment in our history, a very sort of scary and turbulent moment, the Red Scare, the time of the Red Scare and the Hollywood Blacklist, a time really of political inquisition. And it's a time, I think, that has some distinctive echoes of our own perilous political era. In the middle of the film shoot, the screenwriter, Foreman, was called to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities about his former membership in the Communist Party. And at this point, they'd been holding hearings for several months in '51, and Carl was aware that it wasn't going to be enough for him to go before the committee and say, yes, I was once in the Communist Party, I left it, big mistake, I'm very sorry, and that would be enough. He knew that wasn't going to be enough, that besides confessing to his own former participation, he was going to have to accuse other people of being subversives or being communists. He was going to have to name names in order to get out from under this. So for Carl, it comes down to something very simple. Either you betray your friends or you lose your job and the wonderful career you've been building up all this time. And as he pondered what to do about all this, he began to rethink the screenplay. This was in the summer of '51, and he'd written most of the screenplay, but he was starting to make some changes. And he changed it into an allegory about the Hollywood Blacklist and the Red Scare. And the marshal was now becoming Carl himself, and the gunmen coming to kill him were the members of the committee. And the hypocritical and cowardly citizens of Hadleyville, the little small town where all this was taking place, were the folks in Hollywood, Carl's friends, Carl's business partners, who either stood by passively or betrayed him. As I was writing the screenplay, it became insane because life was mirroring art and art was mirroring life. That's what Carl said later about it. And I became that guy. I became the Gary Cooper character. Now, I could just stop here, I suppose, and say, listen, if you want to find out what happens, please buy the book. I'll sign it for you, and we can talk about it later. But I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But first, let's go back and let's meet some of these characters. And the one we want to start with, of course, is Gary Cooper. So he was born in a comfortable Victorian house at the corner of 11th Avenue and Raleigh Street in May 1901. And incidentally, I shouldn't be telling you this, but my wife and I drove by it on our way here, and it's for sale. What's the asking price on? $174,000. Now it needs a new roof. We could see that, and I don't know what else it needs, but it's out there. There's no plaque on it, though if you look across the street at another historic house, there's a mention of Cooper being across the street. But there it is. I just want you to know. You heard it here first. He's the son of British immigrants, interestingly enough. Both his mother and his father came from the UK, and they met in Helena in the 1880s, early 1890s. And he had no idea that he was going to become a movie star, needless to say. That was the furthest thing from his mind. He actually wanted to be an artist. And one of his sharpest childhood memories, and my apologies to Charlie Russell for the quality of this mural reproduction, was seeing the giant mural of Lewis and Clark. And where's that mural? Anybody know? Yeah, it's in the state capitol. It's in the House of it's behind the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives. It's been there since about 1913. And Cooper has a memory of his father taking him to see it and being, amazed by it. And it's the West. I mean, and it's the myth of the West. And so Cooper, as a young man, is captured by it also. And what he wants to be is an artist. Now Cooper's father was a lawyer. And he was appointed U.S. attorney by President Teddy Roosevelt here. And later he served on your state Supreme Court as a justice. But after he retired from the bench and he went into private practice, He and his wife moved to LA. He had a big real estate legal case down there, and they just picked up stakes and moved. And so that's 1924, and that Thanksgiving, their son Gary, who's 23 years old and unemployed, with very little prospects, and broke, he comes down to spend Thanksgiving with them, and he never leaves. He was tall. He was handsome. He had a killer smile. He had smoldering blue eyes, which you can't see in black and white. He had a quiet, laconic manner, very modest, but charming and a bit insouciant. I don't know if he gets that from Montana, but I suspect some of it comes from around here. All of it together. And what he also gets from Montana is he's an excellent writer. And he gets work right away as a stunt writer in Hollywood and an occasional extra in a movie. And even though he had absolutely no formal training as an actor and no particular interest in it when he first gets started, he actually quickly became a star. You know, people like John Wayne and Humphrey Bogart, they spent more than a decade in Hollywood working for very little money in B movies, kind of working on their celluloid persona, the way they talked and walked and that glare in their eyes. And, you know, it took a long time for them to construct it and to become John Wayne and Humphrey Bogart. Not so with Cooper. Almost from the day he arrives, he's working and doing very well. And I would say within 3 years of getting to Hollywood, his name is above the title of every picture he makes, and it stays that way for the next 30 years. He's the ultimate product of the Hollywood system. He makes 2 or 3 and sometimes as many as 5 movies a year. He seduces his female co-stars and just about every other attractive woman he meets. And he makes one, and this is Tallulah Bankhead, incidentally, in The Devil in the Deep, 1932. She certainly was one of the people who was attracted to him, not just on film. And he makes wonderful, successful movies that do very well. Movies like Mr. Deeds Comes to Town and Meet John Doe, The Pride of the Yankees, For Whom the Bell Tolls. And he wins the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1941 for Sergeant York. That same year, the Associated Press reports that his annual income was $483,000. That was the largest salary in Hollywood. But after World War II, the studio system starts to decline. Audiences are beginning to discover new ways of spending their entertainment dollars. Most of the big movie houses are still downtown in the center of cities, whereas people are moving to the suburbs. In 1948, the Supreme Court requires the major studios to divest of the most profitable part of their business, which is to say the movie theater chains that they own all around the country. They could force a theater to show anything they wanted to because they own the theaters. They owned most of them. That all went away after 1948. And the biggest destructive force coming along hasn't really gotten going quite yet in the late 40s, but it's about to really take hold and do enormous, or cause enormous changes in the movie business, is television. So between 1946 and 1948, something like the average weekly attendance at movies dropped from 90 million people. 90 million people a week went to the movies in the 1940s. It drops to 60 million. A third less. And profits plunged something like 70%. But Hollywood's problems weren't just financial. The war had changed a lot of people's attitudes and perceptions about what they wanted to see in a movie, what entertainment was. And the old films, you know, people raising cocktail glasses and looking really good in formal wear. I'm exaggerating. There were a lot of films that weren't like that, but there were a lot that were. Anyway, those weren't really working anymore for people. When the boys come home from the battlefields overseas, they're coming back with new thoughts, new ideas, and new hungers. That's according to Darryl F. Zanuck, who was the head of 20th Century Fox and who himself had gone off to war. And this is what he told his guys on the day he got back. We've got to start making movies that match the new climate of the times. And for a while, Hollywood did that. One of its responses, anyway, was a wave of thought-provoking, socially conscious films, including Gentleman's Agreement, which was about anti-Semitism, and The Best Years of Our Lives, which looks in this poster like it's a romantic comedy, but actually it's about, the difficulties that war veterans had in readjusting to being back in the States. Not only the veterans, but their families and their wives. All the King's Men, Body and Soul, a boxing movie with John Garfield. I mean, there's a long list of really interesting movies in the late 40s that are a little different than what's become before. Now, Gary Cooper was just 50 years old in 1951, but his career was beginning to fade a bit along with the studio system that had helped create him. The roles he was being offered were increasingly mediocre. I mean, you know, Cooper didn't write his own parts. He didn't direct himself. He wasn't the producer of his own movies. He relied on the studio system to create the environment and give him the quality work that would allow him to succeed, and that was beginning to fade. One of the pleasures of working on this book is I got to talk to, you know, the folks I'm writing about it have mostly passed on. But I met family members and relatives who remember them, and I met Gary Cooper's daughter, Maria, who lives in New York and who's an absolutely wonderful person. She's been out here many times, I know, over the years. She said to me, they would send him these crappy scripts, and at some point you have to do one of them. And he was furious at the quality of the material. His health was slipping too, due to a bad back from a childhood car accident that he'd had here in Helena. He had ulcers. He was smoking 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day. He'd been doing that since the end of childhood. And his marriage was unraveling. He was separated from his wife of 17 years, and he was coping with his tempestuous, very talented 25-year-old mistress, Patricia Neal. And the end result of all this was Gary Cooper really needed a break. And fortunately for him, one was on its way. So with the old studio system slipping so badly, a number of small independent little production companies were getting started to fill the gap. You know, today we would describe them, you know, like Silicon Valley startups, you know, nimble, entrepreneurial, you know. They were making movies for less money. They were making smarter movies, cheaper movies. And one of the most successful of these little companies was founded by a guy named Stanley Kramer. That's Stanley on the right, incidentally, with Marlon Brando in 1950. Stanley had arrived in Hollywood in 1936, just out of college, and he worked his way up through the system doing just about every low-level job you could get. He built sets, movie sets, literally with saws and hammers and nails. He also learned how to edit and cut film. He served during World War II as a documentary filmmaker in the Army, and that's where he met Carl Foreman. So these guys were two young, ambitious, fast-talking Jewish intellectuals from New York and Chicago. And they were the sons or grandsons of immigrants from Eastern Europe. You know, almost all the folks I'm talking about tonight are the sons or grandsons of immigrants, Gary Cooper included. They all had that in common. Both these guys, Carl and Stanley, had a deep hunger to succeed. They were very ambitious. That's why they came to Hollywood. They had a social conscience, and they also had a withering contempt for the old studio system. They were going to show the studios how to do it. They had the arrogance of youth, and they had the brains to back it up to a great extent. And after the war ended, Stanley scraped together a little money, and he launched his own little production company that eventually was called the Stanley Kramer Company. And naturally, he turned to his good friend Carl Foreman to be a partner. Their first hit was a little boxing movie called Champion. Has anybody seen it? One person in the backpack. Well, this is in 1948. It's about a ruthless and greedy working-class boxer named Midge Kelly, pounding his way to the top and stepping on his friends and family to get there. And Carl wrote a really tough, remorseless screenplay. It was, you know, and the movie starred a handsome young newcomer, that would be Kirk Douglas, who's another son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So my favorite interview for this book was with Kirk Douglas 2 years ago at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 98 years old then. He's 100 years old now. He was still trim and charismatic. He had a full head of silvery hair, and it was pulled back, and there was a little ponytail in the back. He was small. Kirk was never a big guy, and now he's even smaller than me. But he still was, again, very charming and a lot of fun to talk to. He told me he'd been mesmerized by Carl Foreman's script. And he was determined to play the part of the anti-hero, because that's what this character, Midge Kelly, really is. Even though his agent told him to stay away from it. These guys, who are these guys? They don't own a studio. They don't have any real money. You know, this is not going to be a popular movie, and you're going to look terrible in it. He wanted to do it so badly, though, that when he arrived at Stanley's office to audition for the part, he rips off his T-shirt to show these guys that he's got the musculature, you know, to play the role. And it was a good move on his part, because Champion was an immediate hit. It cost something like $550,000 to make, and it earned something like $18 million over the years. And it was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Performer for Kirk Douglas. This is in his first starring role. He gets nominated for Best Actor, and Best Screenplay for Carl Foreman. And suddenly, Carl and Stanley are hot. And they go on to make a number of very punchy, very interesting movies. Home of the Brave, which is a drama about racism in the Army during World War II. The Men, which is Marlon Brando's first movie role. He plays a paraplegic war veteran at a VA hospital in Southern California. And it's not just the sort of hard-hitting contemporary subject matter that's driving people, or the great performances. It's also the way these movies are made, on very tight little budgets, in black and white, with a very, very talented team of young professionals doing the film editing, building the sets, you know, the design, the artwork. It's all, you know, a bunch of people coming together, even the music. At one point, Kramer recruits a very gifted director, a guy named Fred Zinnemann, to join the company on a 3-picture deal. Fred, naturally, he's from Vienna. He's another immigrant, another Jewish immigrant. He comes over in the mid-1930s. He'd worked for more than a decade at MGM, where he was known for his meticulous craftsmanship as a filmmaker, for his sort of gritty documentary style of the kinds of films he liked to make. And he was also known for his undisguised contempt for the people who ran the studio. And they were very happy to see him go. But Stanley was happy to get him. Now, High Noon didn't have a whole lot going for it. Carl had never written a Western before, and Fred Zinnemann had certainly never directed one. They weren't making that many Westerns in Austria. The screenplay Carl wrote had no beautiful vistas, no Indian raids, no cattle stampedes, none of the kind of stuff people like to see in Westerns. But what it did have were beautifully drawn characters and taut, realistic dialogue. I don't think there's a wasted word anywhere in High Noon. And I counted the last sort of 12 minutes, Cooper says, I think, exactly 8 words, something like that. Anyway, and it has a very suspenseful story, which, as you'll remember, unfolds in real time, right? Roughly 10:30, the movie begins. The marshal's getting married to his new bride, and at about 10:35 or 10:40, they get a telegram just after the ceremony saying that the chief bad guy, the guy that the lawman had put in prison 5 years earlier, has been pardoned and is coming back on the noon train. And 3 of his hired thugs are in town already. So it's 10:40, train's arriving at noon, you've got 80 minutes. Cooper's got 80 minutes to get help, to face these guys, and the clock is ticking. And in every scene, you see the actors looking up toward the end or at some place, and we get a fix on what time it is. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in each one, the clock gets a little bigger. It's filmed a little closer. This is Fred taking full advantage. Has anybody seen the TV show 24? So this is a little bit like a 1952 version of 24. The clock is ticking, and that adds to the suspense. It really helps ratchet it up. It also had, as I had mentioned earlier, this haunting theme song, Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, written by Dmitry Tiomkin, a Jewish immigrant from the Ukraine, and Ned Washington, whose only immigration I could find was from Scranton, Pennsylvania. So there we have a real American. And performed by Tex Ritter. And this from the sort of northeast corner of Texas. And it's played, as you may recall, throughout the film, and it's highly unusual because it tells the story with its lyrics, and it tells it from this point of view of the lawman. It's do not forsake me, oh my darling. He's singing to his new bride. And he's explaining things in the song that he can't explain actually in person. The lawman's somewhat inarticulate. It's hard to explain why he's staying in town when 4 people are coming to kill him. The song explains the whole thing. And it also had great performances. Kramer signed a very talented young actress to play the marshal's new bride. Grace Kelly was just 21 in 1951, but she was already a fairly experienced stage performer, and she'd even done some commercials on that thing called television that was coming along. Kramer liked the way she looked, how beautiful she was, but he also liked the fact that she was willing to work for $750 a week. And the same was true for Katya Jurado, and I need to get a photo of her here too. She's a sultry young Mexican actress who was hired to play the lawman's former mistress. These are 2 strong women characters, rather unusual for 1951. But the biggest coup, I think, in a lot of ways, was snagging Gary Cooper for a bargain price. Cooper knew a good role when he saw one, and he knew he needed a good role. He really wanted this, and he was willing to work for less than half his usual salary. Interestingly enough, both Stanley and Carl were a little bit reluctant to hire him. They saw him as the product of the old studio system. He was kind of a relic, is what Carl said about him later. Plus, he was 29 years older than Grace Kelly, and about 8 inches taller, I would say. Still, I think he brought an authenticity to this thing and a sense of sort of vulnerability that none of the younger actors they were thinking about could have given. They thought about Marlon Brando, they thought about Kirk Douglas, William Holden, who seemed to get offered every male part in 1950 and 51. They had a list of names, Henry Fonda, Gregory Peck. They didn't offer it to many of them, and the ones they did turned it down. So they were, in a sense, stuck with Gary Cooper, and as I say, in the end, I think they were very lucky. I think it makes a huge difference. All those people I mentioned are very talented, but how many of them could have brought that sense of vulnerability and pride that Cooper was able to bring to it? So Carl served as the associate producer for the picture, which means he put together the locations and he lined up the rest of the cast, and he only had $30,000 for the whole supporting cast. It's a bit like constructing a human jigsaw puzzle, to figure out how to get these folks together. Everything had to fit perfectly, and it did in the end. But there was one obstacle that Carl Foreman really couldn't circumvent. So the House Un-American Activities Committee had first held public hearings on alleged communist infiltration of the motion picture industry back in 1947. And here's a photo of one of the hearings. And over there, sitting on the left, on your left, smiling at everybody, is somebody you might vaguely recognize, because that's Mr. Gary Cooper. He's one of the friendly witnesses called early in the hearings to talk about communist activity and to sort of set the stage. And while Cooper couldn't recall the names of anyone who might have offered him sort of leftist-tinged scripts, he said he'd seen a few over the years. He used to read them, he said, right before he went to bed at night, and if he saw anything he didn't like, he'd just throw it in the trash. Cooper was a Republican, he was a strong anti-communist, a strong conservative, but he kind of played deftly with the committee that day. He didn't tell them a whole lot. The result of the hearings, and after these friendly witnesses, including Cooper, they called 10 witnesses who were people who'd been in the Communist Party, and most of them still were in the Communist Party, and they refused to cooperate. And they were known, these were screenwriters, directors, producers. They became known as the Hollywood 10. All had been members of the party in the early 30s and 40s, as I said, and most of them still were. Still, they had support in the film community in 47 for a while anyway. Here you can see Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall and Danny Kaye and a plane load of movie star liberals who flew from Hollywood to Washington to protest outside the committee room. I should add that even Ronald Reagan, who was then head of the Screen Actors Guild and who testified as a friendly witness along with Cooper and a number of other folks, even he questioned the committee's tactics. He thought there was a little something less than American about the Un-American Activities Committee. But by 1951, that's 47, by 1951, things had changed. The Hollywood 10 had been convicted and sentenced to up to a year in prison. Here's 7 of them climbing the courthouse steps in Washington. And their convictions had been upheld by the Supreme Court. And after they were released, the committee decided it was time to go back to Hollywood for a sequel. Now, it's hard to overstate just how intense the fear of communism was in those days in the United States. The Soviet Union had developed the atomic bomb. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and their co-conspirators had been arrested for stealing atomic secrets and giving them to the Soviet Union. By September 1951, more than 83,000 American soldiers had been killed or wounded fighting communists in Korea. And at home, the progressive coalition that had ruled the United States for more than a decade under Franklin Roosevelt was beginning to unravel under Harry Truman. And self-styled Americanists, including these leaders of the committee, and there I think you see on your right of another president-to-be. Anyway, there was the belief out there that outsiders had taken control of our country's institutions and government and culture, for that matter. These were usurpers, and then they were identified in those days as communists, liberals, and Jews, for that matter. Today, we have our own set, I guess, of outsiders who we blame for our condition. That these folks had somehow stolen our country, and that the self-appointed guardians of American values, including these guys, were determined to get it back. And their anger and their rhetoric was just as corrosive and just as vicious as anything we hear today. In fact, for many Americans, I think communism was a threat that was more alarming even than, say, terrorism seems to be today. I mean, communists, after all, could be anybody. Your neighbors, your relatives, close friends, your spouse. They looked and sounded exactly like us, and yet they were the agents of a ruthless foreign power whose goal was to destroy our way of life. They were the enemy within. J. Edgar Hoover called them the masters of deceit. Quote, "A communist is a completely transformed, unrecognizable, and dedicated man." That's what a spokesman for the American Legion said. "While he may retain the physical characteristics of the rest of us, his mental and psychic processes might as well be from another planet." In other words, they were the walking dead, only they were super smart. And so the level of anxiety and fear that this kind of imagery brought up, raised up within the population it's hard to underestimate it. Now, the fact is that, at least in Hollywood, the Communist Party had never been very large or very influential. And by 1951, it was down to maybe 100 active members. It didn't matter. The studios, which, remember, were economically vulnerable and feeling vulnerable, decided to fire and blacklist anyone who refused to cooperate with the committee and with an effort to require people to sign loyalty oaths, to swear they weren't involved, to name other people who were. The fact is that Hollywood was really just a sideshow to the larger struggle. There were blacklists in public schools, and labor unions, and all kinds of institutions, and in government. No atomic secrets were bought or sold or stolen in Beverly Hills. But the symbolic of power of Hollywood, in its extraordinarily high profile, and its abiding role in our national culture made it an irresistible target. I mean, we think of Hollywood as influential today, but really compared, was nothing like it in the 40s and 50s. It really was the real arbiter of our national dreams. The fact is, few people would acquit themselves well during this period, certainly not the committee, which far exceeded the constitutional limits of its powers and acted as basically judge, jury, and executioner over the people it called to the stand. Nor the studios, which caved out of fear of losing its profits, nor political liberals, for that matter, who found themselves trapped between a bullying committee on the one hand and the committee's dogmatic and secretive communist targets on the other, and they ended up enabling the blacklist. And I have to add, not journalists. They didn't do very well either. Some of them cheered the committee from the sidelines, the columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons and the Hollywood Reporter. But even the mainstream press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, they failed to hold a critical spotlight to the process of repression. And for that matter, the Jewish community, which was very influential in Hollywood and very liberal, they too, for the most part, and I'm overgeneralizing maybe a little bit, but not much, they too failed to defend civil liberties. People lost their jobs, partnerships unraveled, friendships were destroyed. And one of the things that was most interesting for me was to discover that the bitterest conflicts weren't between, you know, the people on the committee and the people they called to testify. I mean, you didn't expect, you know, your political enemies to do you any favors. The bitterest conflicts were among friends and business partners and family members. Those conflicts were much more intimate. That was betrayal. That wasn't just political combat. And those conflicts, to a great extent, remain unresolved even today. So when Carl Foreman was first subpoenaed in the summer of 1951, Stanley Kramer gave him his full support. But as the time grew nearer for Carl to testify in September, Stanley grew more fearful. He and his business partners had just signed a really terrific 30-picture, 5-year deal with Columbia, with a big studio. And they were all going to make a lot of money, including Carl. But they were afraid that if Carl didn't cooperate with the committee, that would destroy the deal, because he would be blacklisted and they might be called to testify next. The fact is that Carl and Stanley were also at odds over the making of High Noon. Stanley didn't like the dailies of the film that he was seeing. He thought Fred Zinnemann's gritty documentary style looked too dark and unappealing. He also didn't care much for Gary Cooper's minimalist acting style. He seemed not to be acting at all, but simply being himself, Stanley would say later. I think Cooper could have played the marshal in his sleep. And that's a message from our sponsors. That's happened to me so many times where I've done that I can't. Anyway, I think Cooper could have played the marshal in his sleep, Stanley says. There were times I thought that was just what he was doing. And he didn't mean it as a compliment. Anyway, so Carl, dressed in a dark blue suit and what he called a very sincere tie, takes the committee witness stand on Monday morning, September 24th, 1951 in LA. And asked if he'd ever been a communist, he denied he was one now. But otherwise, he took the Fifth Amendment. He wouldn't answer questions about his prior membership or about anyone else. He refused to name names, and his testimony took less than an hour. And the next day, Stanley Kramer issued a statement through Columbia Pictures saying he had a, quote, total disagreement between Carl Foreman and myself. The stockholders and directors of the Kramer Company would be meeting as soon as possible, and necessary action will be taken at that time. They didn't wait, Carl later recalled. They quit right then and there, and they threw me to the wolves. And Stanley and Carl, remember, they were once very close friends and collaborators. They never spoke again. Carl's widow, Eve, told me that, recalled many, many years later when she and her husband were in an elevator at the Columbia Pictures headquarters, and Stanley stepped into the elevator, and they went up. The two men just stared straight forward, straight at the door. They didn't look at each other. Not a word was spoken, and then they got off, and the other one stayed on. That's what the blacklist could do to you. Carl's lawyer eventually negotiated a settlement with the company, but he had to agree to surrender his associate producer's credit. And soon after that, he announced he was going to form his own independent production company. And although, as I said earlier, Gary Cooper was a conservative, anti-communist Republican, he offered to buy stock in the company. He had grown to trust and admire Carl, working with him on High Noon. He believed him when he said he wasn't a communist anymore. And he said, so count me in. And then Cooper, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, came under extraordinary pressure. First from Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, who questioned what this celluloid icon of Americanism was doing, going into business with an ex-commie. And John Wayne also raised some questions about this. And Cooper takes off for Sun Valley on a skiing trip. And, well, no, he wasn't skiing, I'm sorry. He was hunting and fishing with his good pal, Ernest Hemingway. And a few days later, he calls Hedda Hopper from Sun Valley to tell her that while he is still convinced of Carl's loyalty, Americanism, and ability as a picture maker, He has decided to withdraw. So that's it. That's the end of Carl's hopes of working in Hollywood. And eventually, he leaves Hollywood and he moves to London. And he works as a screenwriter there, mostly under pseudonyms, for 7 or 8 years, until eventually he gets out from under the blacklist. One of his greatest achievements during that time was co-writing with a blacklisted colleague named Michael Wilson, the Oscar-winning screenplay for The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957. And they win the Oscar, as I say, the following year. Now, you can barely see it there, but it says screenplay by Pierre Boulle. He's the novelist who wrote The Bridge over the River Kwai. He wrote it in French. He didn't speak any English, but he had a miraculous ability to write the script. Which is to say that it was finally in 1984 when the Motion Picture Academy recognized that the true authors of Kwai were Michael Wilson and Carl Foreman. And then they held a little ceremony to give them their Oscars, and their widows collected both Oscars because both men were dead. So besides the political warfare, there were creative conflicts over High Noon, as I had sort of suggested earlier, over the performance. Stanley never liked Fred Zinnemann's director's cut. He thought it was flabby and boring, and he says he saved High Noon by cutting it himself. Film editor Elmo Williams disagreed. He says he's the one who saved High Noon by cutting it. And by the way, he's also the one who dreamt up the idea of having that wonderful song, which Stanley said, no, he actually dreamt up. Fred and Carl disagreed with both of them, heatedly at times. It's not uncommon for folks in Hollywood to have these kinds of creative disagreements, especially when a movie becomes a big hit. I think they're still arguing over the use of the mechanical shark in Jaws. But it is true that the political background, the political bloodshed behind this movie certainly helps make these conflicts all the more deeper, and they're conflicts that have never totally been resolved. So my book tells the story of the making of a classic American movie against the backdrop of this tumultuous area in American political history, and a moment in our history that still remains raw and unresolved. No one was put up against a wall and shot during the Hollywood Blacklist or the Red Scare. Yet it was a time of hysteria and persecution, and many innocent people were hurt. I don't pretend to have come up with all the answers to all the questions still surrounding this era. I did have the advantage of the fact that 50 years after the hearings, the House Un-American Activities Committee's confidential files, the ones of executive sessions and investigative files, became public. And I was able to see those, and some of them were very helpful to me in understanding what went on and who exactly testified to what. At the same time, I've been able to uncover some previously unpublished interviews with Carl Foreman for the autobiography he was hoping to write, but that he never did write. And also untranscribed tapes of interviews with him and with Stanley Kramer and with others involved in the making of High Noon. And they've allowed me, in weighing all the evidence and looking at the original script, including there's Fred Zinnemann's original script at the Motion Picture Academy Library in Beverly Hills with Fred's meticulous little pencil markings on every page. And all the clocks are there, and Fred adds about 12 more as he's going through it. Anyway, looking at all that stuff and listening to these interviews has allowed me, I think, to give in the book a more plausible account of who actually deserves the credit for High Noon. And the short answer is, I think they all do. I think it really was a true collaboration among a very talented group of filmmakers working at the highest level. So ultimately, my book is about that small group of very talented people, Cooper and Zinnemann and Kramer and Foreman, who come together to make a compelling, creative work, and what happened to them when they came up against the machinery of political repression. And it raises the question that I think history demands of all of us, that if we were confronted with the same kind of terrible choice that these folks faced, in this case, between betraying our principles or losing our livelihoods, in other words, when the clock strikes high noon, what would we do? So anyway, thank you very much.